Good afternoon. My name is Caroline Frost, and on behalf of RSK, I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this webinar this afternoon on the subject of biodiversity and the relevance for financial institutions. We're going to be finding out where the value is, what driving biodiversity loss is, where the risks are, the challenges, but also hopefully some opportunities to face the finance sector in the coming years, plus some thoughts on how best to integrate hopefully some very positive financial planning with helping the planet. We're delighted to have four experts with us today. We have Tim Hounsome, Managing Director of both RSK Biocensus and Nature Positive. He'll be giving us an important overview of the relationship between biodiversity and the financial sector. Then we'll be hearing from two finance people, Dr. Christoph Bill, Senior Active Ownership Specialist at Credit Suisse Asset Management, and also Kingston Nelson, Associate Director, ESG Alliance Team within Lloyds Bank Commercial Banking. They'll both be giving us their perspectives from within those institutions. Finally, we have Romy Jodica, Project and Technical Manager for Nature UNEP Finance Initiative. She'll be giving us all some ideas on how we might move ahead to find that sweet spot between financial planning and helping the planet. So if I could begin with a few little housekeeping notes, social media tags, of course. We have the RSK group tag. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. So do feel free to share any ideas that you pick up today. Little bit of housekeeping, all your microphones will be turned off, muted throughout the presentation. The questions you can post through on the format to the right, the panel, and they will be listed. Hopefully the popular ones will go to the top so that you can put any questions you have for each of our panelists, and hopefully they'll have time to answer them today. If not, don't worry, because they will all be stored and the panelists will be able to get to you in touch direct to answer those queries that you have. Final thing is that shortly after we finish at 1 o'clock, you'll receive a feedback survey to fill in so that we can continue to hopefully improve these webinars and seminars for your needs and interests. So without further ado, may I ask Tim to join me. Tim is the Managing Director of both RSK Biocensus and Nature Positive. He's going to be giving us an overview of this critical relationship between biodiversity and the finance sector. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and hello everybody. As we're going to be speaking today about biodiversity and finance, I thought it'd be useful to start the session with describing what is biodiversity and why it's so important. In order for the rest of this webinar to make sense, you will need to understand the importance of biodiversity to business and how it affects business in the finance sector. So I think by going first, I'm essentially setting the scene here, and the other panelists will take it from there. I should also say that for the purposes of this talk, I'll be using the words biodiversity and nature as fairly interchangeably. So the first question is, what is biodiversity? Well, of course, we have a definition here. Biodiversity refers to the variety of life on Earth, including everything from bacteria to all species of animals and plants, and the genetic diversity within each species. The interactions between species known as ecosystems are complex, but from these interactions we derive all goods and services to sustain human life. So sounds quite important. Unfortunately, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 10 years, you'll realise that things aren't all great in the world of biodiversity. We're facing unprecedented levels of extinction and decimation of habitats across the world. And just some of these facts and figures on these slides here are pretty sobering. 1 million species threatened with extinction, 68% decline in populations of animals since the 1970s, 75% of the Earth's ice-free land surface has already been significantly altered, etc. But despite this, biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation is still occurring at unprecedented rates, and it's accelerating. And it's not overemphasizing this point to say it's threatening human health, well-being, and the economy. So, in which ways do we benefit from nature? Where do we put the emphasis on this and the value? And it's through things called ecosystem services, and these can be broken down into 4 main areas: provisioning, supporting, and then cultural and regulatory. Provisioning is fairly obvious. It's fairly simple to monetize. Nature produces timber, for example, and we harvest it, we use it. It's the same for minerals. The vast majority of our food, of course, is produced as a part of an ecosystem process. And supporting services is the other one, which would include things like nutrient cycling, primary production from sort of photosynthesis, etc., soil formation, which is linked to soil fertility, of course, which goes back to the food production thing. The third one there, the cultural ecosystem services, are perhaps a little bit more nebulous and harder to monetize, although I'm sure we could put values on these things, but the things like mental health, recreation, educational value, those sort of things. And then finally, we have regulating systems and things like carbon regulation when we actually allow things to happen and have that role. But flood alleviation is another obvious one. And I think these services are quite easy to monetize. The flood alleviation example is good. We spend millions, if not billions of pounds on flood defences. And to be honest, most of those things could have been ameliorated by having the nature do its thing further upstream in the catchments and so on. So we can quite easily place value on those systems and those services. Having said all that, as a big picture, these things are quite hard to quantify in monetary terms. And I think, and I'm hoping today we can explore this a bit more, but I think this connection between what we see and understand as intelligent people knowing how these systems work, that connection between that and business is the biggest challenge I think we face in harnessing the power of business in the finance sector in helping us solve this problem. And I'm a firm believer that the heavy lifting in this is going to be done by business and the finance sector. We'll come back to that towards the end. The World Economic Forum had a go at looking at the value of this on a global level, and they estimated that half the world's GDP is either highly or moderately dependent on nature. $44 trillion, half the world's GDP. So it's, to be honest, it's probably a lot more in reality as well, actually, because there's a lot more sort of nuance to that. But it's almost, it seems silly then that this sort of thing has been for a long time the sort of the domain of the environmentalists or the ecologists or the experts and scientists and not business, because it's so utterly and deeply linked to our prosperity and our survival. Of course, the World Economic Forum also then pointed out that climate change alone could shrink the GDP of the world by 16%. While the value of nature of the global economy is obviously astronomical, there are other elements of risk to businesses and therefore financial institutions that are lending to these businesses. By not understanding or fully understanding the nature reliance underlying their operations and therefore their investments. So I would say investing in a company or acquiring a company should also include an audit of the biodiversity footprint of that company. A full understanding of the nature-based dependencies is critical in any investment decision. The effect of bad PR on brands could in certain circumstances be catastrophic. So imagine a company in the fashion world or the food and drink industry, big brands, highly dependent on public opinion as a result of that. Imagine one of those brands being shown by an NGO or competitor to have caused a localized extinction of a cute, cuddly, enigmatic mammal, such as the red panda you can see here. The PR disaster that would come from that would have significant financial effects across, if a listed company as well, through their shareholders and the stock exchange. So I think that in the future, although things are sort of waking up to these issues slowly, NGOs are going to be pointing out these failings in companies, but I think also other companies' competitors will be doing it as well, because they'll be looking for an edge in the market. So having an audit of the company's nature impact seems like an essential activity to me. Even if companies aren't quite as brand sensitive, they can still be influenced by public opinion. I mean, I think public opinion, once it's aligned and focused, it can influence and change policy and legislation really quite rapidly. And so I think staying ahead of that curve and being future-proofed and knowing where those dependencies are within your business is also critical to your performance. So given this huge significance and heavy reliance business has got on ecosystem services and the potential material risks that companies could be exposed to by not fully understanding their biodiversity footprint, what is business doing? About a year ago, we published a report where we looked at the FTSE 100 companies and just very superficially at the top level looked at what they were talking about when it came to biodiversity through various channels. We asked questions like, had they assessed their reliance on biodiversity? Had they looked at the ecosystem services that their business had relied on and their supply chain? what would the consequences of a reduction of those services be in a significant increase in supply costs, etc. And it was quite enlightening. I'm not going to go through it all here, but I think the two things to point out would be that 71% of those companies in the FTSE 100 had made no mention of biodiversity, or if they had, it had been in passing or indirectly. That's a huge number when you think about it. And then the second bit here, I think it's probably relevant for today, is that of the financial institutions, only 95% of them had showed no evidence of having carried out a biodiversity audit. But I would argue that that constitutes a material risk. And I'm not an expert in this field at all, but my understanding is those sort of things, there's almost a legal requirement to report those material risks. I'd like to finish off quickly here with a positive note, though. I've been in this field for 20 odd years. 10 years ago, I was having some conversations with businesses and people from the financial world, and there were nice conversations, but we weren't getting anywhere. I felt there was a disconnect between the language we were talking, essentially. And I said they sort of knew what I meant, but at the end of the day, they couldn't see why it was important to them. This has changed hugely in those last 10 years, and it's accelerating. The last year or two even has really changed that. So I'm really positive about the change, and I think there's a lot we can do. And like I said earlier, the solution to this is the business world and the finance sector. But I think the key for me is changing and shortening that communication gap, getting over that language barrier. Ecologists don't know finance world. The finance world up until now haven't known much about ecologists. What we're doing today is shortening that gap. But I feel confident that we're at that tipping point now, that we're at a step change, there's a paradigm shift in the world's perception of these issues. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tim, for starting us off on the road today. You've made it quite clear what the stakes are, key to our survival and prosperity. I just wonder if I might quickly ask you, why do you think it's taken so long in comparison with the pursuits of carbon zero, climate change, for the finance sector and other institutions to get across the need for biodiversity accommodation?
That's a good question, and I guess that the answer could be multivariate, but I think probably thinking about it, companies that rely very obviously on raw materials and supply chain have started to think about this a bit earlier in the process, because they can always touch and feel and see the problem in front of them. I think when you go to investments in the finance sector, they're a little stage removed from that, and those organisations and companies can't see that and feel it. So I think there's a little bit of awakening up. But I also think the counter to that is that now things are changing. I think they're changing really fast, because people are now seeing the effect on the value of these companies and the material risks that these things can represent, and that's really making people, pick their ears up and listen and look at what's going on.
For sure. Thank you very much for now. I'm sure we'll come back to the role financial institutions have to play. May I now ask Dr. Christoph Beal to join me. He is the Senior Active Ownership Specialist, Credit Suisse. His areas of expertise include quantitative and qualitative research on the development of engagement approaches and stewardship concepts globally. During his time in academia, he has advised, collaborated and provided expert opinion on ESG topic for leading organisations in the financial industry. Christoph, maybe please have your perspective.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Tim, for the introduction and setting the scene so nicely. So my perspective, or the perspective that I would like to offer today, is the perspective of an active owner. Is the perspective of what we have been doing in the past, or what we're still doing as part of the active ownership team within Credit Suisse Asset Management. So again, to set the scene, I think what is absolutely crucial, and Tim already elaborated on that, is we have to understand that economies are embedded within nature. There is no disconnect in reality. So we as investors also need to understand, or we are understanding, that we need to have a conversation with the companies of how aware they are of this interconnection and how they're going about it. And that is essentially why we started a pilot on biodiversity engagement, and that is a pilot that we started last year. And we wanted to have this conversation with the companies across different industries. We did not just want to focus on the obvious industries and the obvious targets, but as Tim elaborated, and as you could see in the previous quote, the economy is embedded within nature. The economy takes place within nature. At the end of the day, it's not just certain high impact industries, but it's all industries. And part of this active ownership approach and part of our engagement pilot is exactly what Tim said, and like you said it very well, closing the language gap. Having these conversations where we as investors can offer, of course, our expertise. We can also offer expertise on the biodiversity side and have conversations with companies, also including SMEs, who normally might not be having these conversations. Now, the reasoning, again, why we chose to have this conversation across the different industries is because we wanted to understand, on the one hand side, what do companies do in terms of operations, in terms of materiality and risk analysis, but we also wanted to understand how do companies look into their supply chains, where quite often the bigger risk lies. Now, in terms of the response or the outcome, we presented that here. What I find quite interesting here is that in terms of materiality analysis, like trying to understand what and how does biodiversity or natural capital matter for the business model, only 46% of the companies we talked to had not at least partially looked at this. And if you're looking at the biodiversity impacts on the other side, that is even higher. The number of companies that have looked partially into it is as high as 46%, and the ones that could say, yes, we have looked into it and we have reported on it, is as high as 18%. Now, what I find quite interesting is when we then look into the biodiversity dependencies, so to try to figure out how much a company's business model, how much a company's strategy actually relies on biodiversity, on natural capital, 56% of the companies have not even partially looked at that. And maybe to explain a little bit what that could be, just to get a couple of examples on this, even if you're looking at pharma industry, and the R&D of pharma industry to a large degree depends on microbial diversity. So the research and development takes samples of microbial cultures for the research process, and as this microbial diversity gets destroyed, there is a challenge for the R&D in the pharma industry, which is just, I try to give you an example, which is not, again, it's not one of the obvious ones, but it's again an industry that we had conversations with and that is embedded within nature. Another example is the tech industry. We specifically, in addition to basically looking at a sample across the industries, focused on the tech industry. The reason is because of previous movements like the conflict mineral free supply chains. We know that the supply chains in the tech industry are well mapped. So we try to understand how well are the supply chains, given that they are mapped, how well are the dependencies and the materiality and risk analyses advanced in the tech industry in their supply chains. And as part of these conversations, we came across a very interesting additional point, which is the role of enablers. Because if we think about biodiversity, we often hear about the companies that destroy, we often hear about the companies that create or improve. And what we found is kind of a third group of companies that enable. In this case, for example, providing time for computing, like high resource intensive computing, to startups, to small research groups, which could have normally not afforded to buy this time at a supercomputer. So again, like we found it quite interesting in our conversations that we also have this role of enablers that provide support for solutions to startups or to smaller research groups. And that would be basically my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. Without being unnecessarily dramatic, of that pretty surprising, I don't want to say shocking, 55% of companies unaware of this, what would you say is the biggest risk that they face with that lack of knowledge?
Yeah, thank you. I think what we see, especially, it's important to differentiate a little bit. Like what we see is that in larger companies, the knowledge is often there in some departments, but it's not very much brought together on a strategic level or on a company-wide, group-wide level. And what we also see sometimes is that in SMEs, the knowledge is not there, because you don't have the financial means to hire a dedicated person, to hire a dedicated team if you're a small enterprise. So the risks that we would see there is the longer you wait to basically prepare or to look into the dependencies on the biodiversity side, the harder it will be to replace it, the harder it will be to make that switch in your supply chain later on, because at a later stage, everybody will want or will have to switch. So the sooner you make, you look into the material issues in your business model, the higher the chance that you can do this successfully.
And turning it around to be even more positive, what would be an opportunity for somebody taking that early decision and going in higher up the chain?
And we're seeing with different companies that we are talking to, we're seeing really positive developments, and we're seeing really positive approaches. This might be R&D, because if you, just as an example, if you invest into the direction of recycling and circular economy, it reduces your reliance on virgin resources. And if you reduce your reliance on virgin resources, you reduce the stress on natural capital. And that's, of course, also a cost-saving opportunity, right? Because you can actually dive into a completely new pool of materials and a completely new source of raw materials.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today. We'll be hearing from you again. So now I would like to ask Kingston Nelson to join me. He is the Associate Director of the Sustainability and ESG Finance team within Lloyds Bank Commercial Banking. Kingston leads this team. It's supporting corporates in construction, infrastructure, manufacturing, transport. During this time, he has worked with his clients to navigate these developments that we've heard a little bit about on the topic of biodiversity. Welcome, Kingston. Please share with us some thoughts today.
Caroline, and thank you for participating. It's really, really interesting actually listening to the other speakers today, and I think there's definitely some common themes between Tim and Chris. First of all, I mean, it's clear that it's really important for companies to be understanding their own biodiversity footprint in terms of their own direct emissions, but also the impacts in terms of, apologies, slides are getting ahead of me, but also the vulnerabilities of the business to biodiversity and the dependencies of the business to biodiversity. One point that I think Tim really, highlighted was actually, particularly in the finance sector, there are other ways and other roles that we have to play in this puzzle. We effectively are able to free capital and to provide capital and use it as a force for good. And in the market, what we started to see is two broad categories of financing products that have kind of emerged. Both are governed by market principles established by the LMA, so the Loan Markets Association, or ICMA, the kind of bond equivalent, International Capital Market Association. if I start on, I guess the first kind of category or bucket of products we're seeing, these are what we commonly see coined as use the proceeds products. So effectively, these products they can take the form of a bond, they can take the form of a loan, but the actual funds, the actual proceeds have to be ring-fenced and trapped and can only be used for certain eligible, predefined green or social criteria. If that criteria is green, you commonly hear these referred to as green loans or green bonds. And an example of eligible projects might include projects that aim to reduce energy or improve energy efficiency, reduce emissions, reduce waste. On the social side, you often hear these referred to as social bonds or social loans. These very much focus on providing access to essential services or providing social housing, for example. And then you have what's called sustainability transactions, which are effectively just a combination of the two. Now, in context of biodiversity, you can probably see from the bottom bullet point on the street, on the screen. But actually, there are, on the environmental side, on the green side, there's two categories that fit quite well in terms of encompassing biodiversity aligned projects. The first of which being environmentally sustainable management of living, natural resources and land use. And the second being terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity. So what we've seen is quite a lot of companies or organizations who have actually issued financing where effectively the proceeds, amongst other categories, can be spent on biodiversity related projects. Some examples being the UK government, University College London, and also Thames Water. If I move on to, I guess, the second category of products that we tend to see. So these are what we refer to as sustainability-linked financing. So in essence, these are quite different from what we call our use of proceeds financing or use of proceeds products, in the sense of there isn't the same restriction on how those proceeds can be spent. So these can be spent on general corporate purpose. And for that reason, companies quite like them because they can be less restrictive in terms of their kind of general their general refinancing. That being said, there is still a ESG component, and in this instance, this takes the form of, I guess, ESG KPIs. So again, these particular products are governed by market governing principles, and these principles help to set out actually what criteria the KPIs need to hit in order to be considered ESG aligned or green or social. Materiality is key here. So if we're looking at certain industries such as the food and drink industry or construction companies, the construction industry, house builders, then of course, when you have land use and consideration of raw materials, you could also include manufacturing, agriculture as well, then actually biodiversity is clearly very material to these companies. The targets themselves will then be benchmarked against historic performance, against peer performance, and against international standards and benchmarks and frameworks. And the KPIs and trajectory really need to go beyond BAU. So not just meeting legislation, but going above and beyond that and showing that actually there is, I guess, a proactive effort to improve on those ESG metrics, or in this case, biodiversity. With these particular products, I forgot to mention on the previous slide, but they both tend to attract a kind of financial benefit or penalty. In context of use of proceeds facilities, these typically attract a financial benefit, though it isn't a fundamental part of the principle, so not always. In the case of sustainability-linked facilities, however, they have to have that financial mechanism built in to align with the principles. And we typically see that if targets are hit, that receives in a benefit to the client, and if targets are missed, then it results in a financial penalty or premium. Again, in context of biodiversity, a good example would be Hill Group. So Hill Group are a house builder. They're actually the first house builder in the UK to issue a sustainability-linked loan, and Lloyd's acted as green ESG coordinator on that particular facility. And what Hill Group did was effectively they're a house builder, and they have to abide by the new legislation that passed in the Environment Act late last year, but that will come into effect late next year, which effectively mandates that they have to achieve a biodiversity net gain on any development that they work on going forward. So effectively, that framework allows us to find a way to effectively calculate and assess a biodiversity unit or percentage improvement, and to incentivize that improvement using our financial products. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kingston. We've heard an awful lot about greenwashing in the media. I wonder, from your perspective, how do you address those concerns when you are entering into an ESG financing agreement?
Yeah, great question. So really, the first, I guess, barrier, or the first kind of thing to protect against greenwashing is the principles themselves. So the principles clearly state out what factors must be achieved in order for a facility or a product to be defined as ESG. And again, you're looking at the ambition of those KPIs versus various different benchmarks. There are also external providers. You may often hear them referred to as second-party opinion providers, who actually can effectively, a company can pay them to produce a due diligence report that assesses the ambition level and the alignment to the sustainability-linked or use of proceeds principles.
So transparency is key in all of this.
100%. And on top of that, on the public side, it's required that the performance is reported publicly, so for bonds. On the loan side, that isn't always a requirement, but targets do need to be externally verified.
Okay, a final question for you. What obstacles have you seen personally that are preventing biodiversity considerations becoming even more common within these ESG financing agreements? Where are the breaks at the moment?
Yeah, another great question. And actually, the key challenges really, I would say, are around the lack of framework that we can actually tie these metrics to. And hopefully that's where the upcoming biodiversity COP will help. But when you look at carbon, for example, there is a very defined way of measuring carbon. There are a lot of frameworks that highlight actually, I guess, what trajectory of carbon improvement we should be aiming for. The same thing doesn't necessarily exist currently in biodiversity, or is a bit more fragmented. Biodiversity net gain is is a concept. Well, biodiversity net gain in terms of in context of development, for example, does provide a framework, but actually we need to be looking at the full value chain.
Thank you very much. Right, final speaker today is Romy Jodica. She is a project and technical manager for Nature UNEP Finance Initiative. She has been leading the work on nature-related risk and is also coordinating UNEP's FI support to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Romy, please share with us your views on what role the financial sector can play.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, RSK, for inviting me to speak at this webinar session. I'm at a live event in Brussels, so if you hear some background noises, it's due to that. So UNEP Finance Initiative is a public-private partnership between the UN Environment Programme and the global financial sector, with the purpose of catalyzing action across the financial system to deliver more sustainable economies. We're the home to the Net Zero Alliances, and we also coordinate the work, among others, of the principles on sustainable insurance and principles on responsible banking. Within the nature team, we work to mainstream nature in all financial decision making. And as Caroline alluded to, we have been one of the founding and today implementing partners of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. Other work includes our work on the Encore tool and database, which helps organizations to explore natural capital opportunities and risk. Other work are the sustainable blue economy principles, in which we try to look at investment into oceans and other blue economy. My role indeed includes overseeing our support to the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So if we can go to the first slide, Amrit. Can we go? Yeah, the next one, please. So although we see an alphabet soup of initiatives emerging, such as TNFD, the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, Align, Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, Financing Nature, we're still losing nature at rates unseen in human history. So on this picture, you see a dragonfly, and according to the first global assessment of this species that were completed at the end of last year, nearly 1/5 of dragonfly species are at risk of extinction, mostly due to habitat change. So although biodiversity is the fastest evolving ESG theme in global capital markets, we need to up the ante to support and protect nature. So if we go to the next slide, and there is an overlap with some of the statements made by earlier speakers on this session, which refers indeed to the excellent research done by the World Economic Forum, in which they say over half of economic output depends on nature. It's also an often misquoted research, because ultimately, of course, 100% of our economies depend on nature. As the IPBES, or the IPCC for Nature, showed, there are nearly an estimated 1 million species at risk of extinction due to pressures, most of them in the near future. And nearly 3 trillion could be lost from global GDP without sustained action. That is why risks related to biodiversity loss are among the highest and most impactful, according to the Global Risk Report, again from the World Economic Forum. And I think this all shows and underlines, and that's why we have the word oikos at the bottom of this slide, that economy and ecology both come from the same Greek word oikos. And as Greta Thunberg said, our house might be on fire. So we need to take action now before it's too late. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a highlight of what we as UNEP Finance Initiative try to do to support this work and embed nature within mainstream financial decision making. We do this to work on an alignment of financial flows with a focus on risk, among others, through our work in support of TNFD. We work on the policy environment, so I'll speak about that later, and we work also on thematic areas. So if we go to the next slide, so this year, COP27 won't be the most important environmental event taking place. It's actually COP15, and when I walk around at events, people sometimes come to me and say, no, Romy, you got it all wrong. It's COP27, not COP15, but I'm pretty sure that it's COP15. So this is taking place in Montreal early December under the presidency of China, and it's really the last opportunity to develop a global biodiversity framework that will allow us to live in harmony with nature by 2050. Until now, the environmental discussion, so the E in ESG mostly has been the C for climate, but we really want to see beyond the C and really look into all environmental aspects. Also because we know that it's mathematically impossible to reach net zero without becoming nature positive. Also, we see the role of algae, coral reefs, and mangroves playing an important role through nature-based solutions in solving today's climate crisis. At the same time, we see that a lot of the text that's being negotiated in Montreal is still between brackets. So it means that it's still under discussion. So from our side, we find it very important that, and that's why we have these two pictures in this slide, that Montreal will be the next Paris and not the field discussions that took place in Copenhagen. So if we go to the next slides, one of the key topics is, according to UNEP's State of Finance for Nature report in 2021, we called for closing a $4.1 trillion financing gap in nature by 2050. Now only about 14% of investments in nature-related opportunities come from the private finance sector. So, and the numbering of this slide is a bit off, as we all can see. There is this importance of aligning financial flows to bridge the finance gap, which is both looking at financing green, so looking into opportunities to invest in nature, but also greening finance. So through initiatives such as TNFD, others, looking in how business operations, among others, of financial institutions can be changed. So if we go to the last slide, UNEP works, among others, to build capacity and understanding. So this shows an overview of a few of the publications within the nature space that we have put out to market. More recently, if you go to our website today, we have published a publication on the market readiness of financial institutions for the TNFD. So I think that gives you interesting insights. We provide webinars, and something we also do as UNEP is that we have a TNFD piloting program in which, together with nearly 40 financial institutions across the globe, we're testing the draft TNFD beta framework, so that we can both build the capacity of FI members, but also provide feedback and understanding. So I think this is my last slide, and with that said, I want to thank you again and take it back to Caroline. Yeah, so indeed these are also some of the webinars we organize and other activities. So
thank you, Romy. You're tireless by the looks of things. Thank you for joining us today from your seminar over in Europe. One question for you at the moment. You mentioned COP15, the road to COP15. Why is that so important, particularly for the financial sector, do you think?
This is really nature's last boarding call. So we both need the finance industry there. We need them to be committed. I think very little people within the finance industry will know the ACHI targets, so it's very important to have them on board. At the same time, we see that nature is an emerging financial risk, so it's also good business for financial institutions to understand and to act on nature before it's too late.
I have one more for you, I suppose. It went very quiet. I mean, we all got very excited about Glasgow last year, and then it went a little bit quiet on the conversation. What are your biggest hopes for COP15?
I think my biggest hopes for COP15 is to have an agreement that is ambitious, but at the same time also actionable for financial sector actors. Because I think in previous GBFs that wasn't the case so much. So I think this is now much more mirroring the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think there's much more thinking in how this can also be embedded within financial institutions. So my hope is to have something that is both ambitious and actionable.
Fighting words. Thank you very much. Thank you all for panelists for your presentations this afternoon. May I ask all of you to join me back in the room so we can take some questions. Please do keep your questions coming through. I have a few follow-up questions for you to start with. So Tim, you touched on obviously the relationship between the financial sector and biodiversity. What do you think is the single biggest role of the finance sector in pushing these ends through? How can they move the needle, as it were?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess if we all knew the answer, then that's exactly what we would be doing. But for what it's worth, I think that I'm from the conservation background. I'm a trained ecologist, researcher, etc. I have lots of conversations with people that work in NGOs, and I've often in the past argued with them that things aren't going to change until this becomes financially painful, that somebody needs to see this as a risk, as a loss, as an opportunity, as a benefit. And there's a large element of that NGO world that distrust big business, distrust finance. They don't understand it. And that's what I was talking about before, about that gap. So I think the biggest role, and when we look back in hopefully in 30, 40 years time, those of us will be around, we'll see that this was the key change point, was when the monetization of this became an imperative that we just couldn't stop. So it gets its own momentum going, and then you don't need to have that lobbyist sort of movement anymore. It just becomes part of business as usual. And I think monetizing this and making it part of business as usual is going to be the single biggest effect that can have on this.
Money talks, right? As ever.
It does, yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's the problem. I think culturally, conservationists in the NGO world are quite anti-money, and that's the cultural barriers we're trying to break down here. Money does talk, and we have to live with it, but that is the way we're going to change it.
Build the bridges. Thank you. Following on from that, Christoph, you mentioned this enormous survey you conducted of so many different industries. It sounds exhausting. I wonder if you could shed some insight on who was the most receptive of the sectors and what other sectors could possibly learn. What was the biggest lesson that they could learn from those ones who did show receptiveness to your approach?
Yeah, sure. I think the interesting part is that we almost have the obvious targets, right? Like we have extractive, we have companies with large reliance on palm oil, where we have seen attention on those industries for quite a while now. And there, the wording would be different. Like there wouldn't necessarily be a lot of coverage on biodiversity, but we would see a lot of coverage on deforestation. We would see coverage on land use change. And if we are thinking about the drivers of biodiversity loss, we are kind of in the middle of the discussion. So I think what I found interesting is that, yes, we have, if you want to call it that way, the obvious targets where we have a lot of attention, and then it becomes a bit more nitty-gritty, if you want. So like it's then more that you have certain companies in certain industries that have done a lot of thinking around that. Yeah, so it's difficult to say that we have clear leading industries, if you want. It's a bit more the case that you have leaders within those industries who have early on decided to take on the topic and to either from, and I think starting stronger from an impact perspective. So industries that were in the focus because of an impact, and a little bit less from a dependency perspective. So what we are now seeing a little bit more is that this dependency conversation is starting, and then I think we start seeing slightly different sectors that will pick up that conversation.
Do you feel that the media is supportive in those aims?
I think so. I mean, like what Kingston said earlier in his presentation, transparency is key. What I mentioned briefly previously is about the SMEs. I think we also need to slightly we should not assume that every company that has a problem in terms of sustainability is doing that on purpose. Right? Like again, if we have an SME and a problem pops up in the supply chain, I would in a lot of cases say that is because of a lack of knowledge rather than because of on purpose going for XYZ solution. So again, repeating what a lot of you already said, building the bridges and closing the language gap. And I think that is what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Kingston, I have a follow-up for you. You talked about ring fencing the loans and the funds, the grants, the myriad of opportunities. I wonder, with that comes, as you said, the only way to enforce it is with financial penalty. Could somebody coming to you argue that it's quite hard for them to hit what is effectively a moving target, because this is an expanding field with ever-changing requirements as we learn more about the world and what is being threatened? How do you navigate that for them so that they don't feel that it might not be worth taking that financial risk if they're going to end up paying more than they actually get from you to begin with?
Yeah, that's a very great question. I think first of all, we always look at everything in context of that particular company. We acknowledge that what is ambitious for one company might actually be considered unambitious for another, and vice versa. So this is where, again, looking at those benchmarks that I mentioned, we would look at peer performance. So we would look at kind of similar peers and use that to actually understand what is within the realm of possibility. Historic performance, so actually comparing them against themselves. And then I also mentioned there is that kind of aspect of kind of going above and beyond legislation. So that's the first piece on that. The second piece is, when looking to implement sustainable financing, you're not looking to redefine a company strategy. So I guess as a finance industry, we can help to incentivize. We can help to provide bridges and tear down barriers, but we're not there to tell our clients what to do. So we effectively would look to see actually what is it you're already planning to do within your strategy, and is this deemed to be ambitious to again to all of those benchmarks.
I'm sure they will be relieved and pleased to hear that, to say that. Final question for you, Romy. The very first step then, let's go back to the start. The first step for FIs, what kind of lens should they be operating, looking through? Do you recommend a sense of risk, of what is at stake, or a sense of opportunity and adventure?
Yeah, it's kind of the question, like, who is your favorite child, right? So I think in a way, financial industry needs to become a full-blown Indian goddess with 6 arms and should be doing everything at the same time. From my side, with my support to TNFD, I think the measuring hat is very important. So to make sure that you're making steps into the right direction, and the steps that you're taking are absolutely material. At the same time, I don't want to see it only through this risk lens, because I think in a way, investing in nature is a huge opportunity. So financial institutions across the world should see that opportunity and should start investing in it. And what I see also coming from that conservation background that Tim alluded to, I see conservation organizations changing in operations. So I think there is an ecosystem of partners that can support you in your work. So thank you, Caroline. Somebody's opening the door here, but yeah.
We know you're very busy. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think we can be left in no doubt as to the importance of the financial sector in protecting the planet through supporting and incentivising, hopefully, biodiversity aims. We've heard about risks, enormous opportunities, and the real takeaway, I think, is don't be on the back foot. I hope you will continue to put questions to the panelists. You can email them through to RSK and they will make sure that they land in the inboxes of the right person for you to address your queries to. Thank you to all of my panelists today, and to everybody for joining us. Please fill in the feedback survey when it wends its way to your inbox, and also finally make a note in your diaries for 15th of November, COP15 series, next webinar, all about science-based targets for nature and how to embed those targets into business strategy. But for now, thank you all very much and good afternoon.